Participants, as part of self-leadership, need to identify which leadership roles best suit their nature and abilities. We asked leaders in development to share some personal examples of when they have done this.
Any justice solution has to be one that enjoys local legitimacy. And so putting together the teams of people that could build that trust and credibility with their local counterparts, that to me I think has been the way in which I've tried to exercise my leadership. It's not because I have the answer and if you pay me enough money or you twist my arm, I'll provide it. Nobody knows what the answers to these problems are. They're only negotiated solutions. And in countries like Sierra Leone and other parts of Africa where the existing resource base for dealing with these challenges is so shallow, the World Bank and other development actors really can play an important role. But if they see their role as expert, and by expert they infer from that they have worked in a bunch of other countries and thus they have the answer to these particular problems, then they actually become part of the problem. And so leadership in this sense is almost trying to divest yourself of a sense that your fancy degrees and your other work that one might have done elsewhere suddenly provides you with warrant for being able to dispense quite definitive advice to people. And so leadership is a very different kind of task in a situation where the problem doesn't lend itself to a technical solution but requires very committed teams of people to work together for long periods of time. So that's really how I think I've had to exercise my leadership there.
It is important as a leader to be self-aware enough to find where your comfort zone is in terms of your leadership style. It's only by doing that you can avoid burnout. You know, if you're constantly trying to be somebody else or manage in a way that's not natural to you, you burn out. It's in the long term, it's inevitable. For me, that comfort zone is around being a thought leader. Kind of one of my mantras that I'll admit is to try to be the one who knows the most on the subject in the room. And use that knowledge to build confidence and to build trust in the opinions and and to persuade the directions that I'm trying to help things move into. Having said that, though, I think it's also important not to remain stuck in that leadership style. Different situations do require taking on different approaches in order to get certain things achieved in your role as a leader. Now, it's very important not to remain fixed in our comfort zone of leadership style. So one example is that when we're in a moment where we actually need to build a new shared vision, we need to be able to, for that time, tactically move into a strategic leadership style to build that consensus and build that vision. Another example of where we need to be able to adapt ourselves to management styles that aren't necessarily our comfort zone is when we need to innovate. That's when we need to play more of a boundary spanning leadership role in order to find other ideas that'll help us to sort of break ruts in the way we're implementing our programming in order to move ahead. Another example of where we need to be able to move into other leadership styles that might not be our comfort zone is around the fact that as leaders, as managers, all of us are responsible for nurturing up our more junior staff, both for their own career direction for the organisation, but also for succession planning for your own department, to be able to make yourself redundant when you move on to another role. If any of your team members move on to another organisation or another role in the wider organisation, they need to be replaced. Now, that requires an enabling leader style so that each of your team members then is learning and stretching into skills that are actually 1 or 2 grades above their current position. If we don't do that, then the organisation suffers as soon as anyone leaves the organisation.
I think that when I was younger, I had a really clear idea of what a leader was. Someone who kind of could stand up in front of a room and bang a drum or be noisy and inspirational. And I think that it was really interesting for me to start working in campaigns, and especially in grassroots campaigning, where the focus of that is really enabling other people to reach their capacity, really leading through other people rather than leading from the front. And so I suppose that when I started in campaigns feeling like I needed to be constantly stepping up and setting the tone and pushing people forwards, it was a little bit uncomfortable for me. But the more and more that I was able to achieve success by mentoring people and trying to build their capacity and giving them the tools to succeed, the more I started to realize that this is how I lead people. I lead people by enabling other people to do their best work rather than trying to instruct them to follow me in a certain set pattern to achieve a certain outcome. It's the way that I work for everything, not just campaigning now, but I feel like in a team that I'm working with, I feel like the best ideas come when I give people the space to do their best work. When I'm working with different organisations in a coalition, or when I'm working in a difficult team, I find that enabling approach is the thing that really gets the best results for me. And I think it's partly the way that I am, it's partly my nature, but it's also something that's just been really effective for me as well.
Yes, I'm personally a very strong believer in what you might call situation-based leadership. And what that means is you adapt your leadership style to the situation or the context in which you're operating. So there are a number of contexts in which you can apply different approaches. And for me, those contexts are firstly contexts in which you are working in an environment possibly under significant pressure, where there is a need for what you might call directive leadership styles, where it's important for leaders to be quite clear, quite definitive, and directional in how they approach their leadership responsibilities. I would say personally that is a style that I would deploy in probably less than 10% of time, and is restricted to situations where there might be a degree of urgency or emergency, where decisions need to be taken in a very timely way, often based on imperfect information. The next style of leadership that I would think would be important in terms of situational leadership is what's called emergent leadership. And this is a leadership style where you are often at the beginning of a process, whether that's a strategy development process or a planning process, where the role of a leader is actually to subsume their own views, subsume their own voice, and create an enabling environment for relevant internal staff and stakeholders to come together to co-create strategic direction or plans. And emergent leadership is around consciously subsuming your own views, subsuming your own voice, and creating an enabling environment that brings together that diversity of views within an organisation that can then coalesce into plans or strategies that are widely owned and widely understood. And then somewhere in the middle between directive leadership at one end of the extreme and emergent leadership at the other end of the extreme is what I would call strategic leadership. And that's leadership where, in a situation where you have clear plans, you have clear strategies, and you're working with and through your staff and teams to deliver on those. So that form of leadership is about accompaniment for staff, clearing blockages when blockages need to be cleared, constructive challenge to staff within organisations, and where appropriate, performance management where performance is not matching your aims or objectives. So those three, if you like, typologies of leadership, directive, strategic and emergent, personally the three styles that I am conscious that I refer to in different contexts depending on the nature of the situation.
So a personal example of sort of finding the right kind of leadership style for me was born of failure. I think it probably often is with people. So I was managing the research team in Oxfam. I live in London. I was finding it very hard to go up to Oxford enough to do it properly. And I was getting more and more interested in ideas, in writing. I had a book coming out. I was writing a blog every day. And I just kind of started to neglect my management role. It eventually reached a point where I messed up and we had a big discussion, and everyone agreed that I was a rubbish manager. And I was the first to agree that. And we said, well, okay, well, what are you doing well? And what it became clear subsequently was that the stuff I was doing well was blogging, writing, interacting with people outside Oxfam and inside Oxfam about the ideas that are coming up all the time in development. We now call that a thought leader. It's a phrase I hate because it sounds terribly pompous, but there's something about that intellectual engagement when you don't need to be a manager or have a budget. You actually just get out there and discuss ideas with people. And ever since we discovered this role for me, and it just emerged, and we called it strategic advisor because no one knows what that means. It's quite a good phrase. I've been incredibly happy and I think quite productive. So when you find the right style for you, suddenly it unleashes a huge amount of energy and you can really start to enjoy yourself.
So yes, I definitely agree that taking a leadership role is suited to yourself is really important. And I believe it is all about getting to know yourself better. Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? Are you good with intuition, or are you a thinking person? So for me, I identify myself as an introvert, and I believe I'm good with deep engagement with ideas and concepts. I'm good at critical thinking. And I believe that my organization depends on me for coming up with ideas and, critical appraisals and, working with people, fostering shared vision, these kind of things. But let's just say if there comes a role where a boundary spanner or, an extrovert is more suited. So what would I do? So the first thing I would do is I would try to delegate that role to another person who is more suited to it. But if I don't have that opportunity, I will take that role. The key difference is understanding that what is your strength and trying to improve it, but also working on weaknesses. Again, the key difference is you set high performance standards for areas which are your strengths, but you set realistic standards and you give yourself room for error when the area is not your core strength.
Yes, the role that I had, my last role as CEO of the Nigerian Women's Trust Fund, definitely suited my persona. Less the outgoing, having to speak publicly, but by then I'd gotten over that fear. Thankfully, my stint as internal communications manager had dealt with the public speaking fears. I could do that but one of my strong traits is that I like to rattle the status quo. I'm never comfortable with just how things are, especially if they're not working and especially if they're not fair to most people. So my role as CEO of the Nigerian Women's Trust Fund, where we were advocating to get more women into government, for me suited me to a T, because there were so many elements of trying to get more women into government that suited my persona. It was unfair that there were not more women because half of Nigeria is women. We need more women in decision making to be able to reflect the realities of women in Nigeria and girls in Nigeria. So it was unfair. It would change the status quo if we had more women. Right now, for example, our parliament has less than 7% women making laws. The ideal is about 30%. The average across Africa is about 22%. So at 7, we're extremely low. So again, I liked being part of that conversation where I was explaining why it was really unfair and how we had to change things. So that really suited me. Trying to make a connection between social justice for women and girls, improving lives, education, health. In Nigeria, we have really woeful maternal mortality indices. So for me, everything about the life of being a woman, and I could relate to that because I'm a woman. And even while I recognize that I come from a privileged part of society, I've been educated, my mother was educated, I'm not unaware of the fact that I have cousins and relations who have not been as fortunate as I have. In fact, my aunt, my mom's older sister, never went to school. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather had 14 children. Obviously, he had a polygamous home. He died before I was born, so I never got the chance to ask him how he decided who would go to school and who wouldn't. But fortunately enough, my mom did. But that kind of Russian roulette with people's lives for me is just unfair. How do we expand opportunities for everybody? Let people make their choices. I would rather we had a situation where every girl could go to school, and when she got to a certain age, she said, I don't want to go to school anymore. That's fine, then you exercise your choice. But a situation where arbitrarily, based on culture, interpretation of religion, people's lives are sort of mapped out for the rest of their lives, because if you don't go to school, you can't earn a living, And if the interpretation of your religion says you shouldn't go out, literally you can't function, you can't be productive. And I see a lot of what we're talking now in Nigeria and probably in other parts of the world about lots of Muslim women who are relying on drugs, who are relying on alcohol to sort of dull the pain and the emptiness in their lives. And I tell people, it's not enough to start trying to treat the symptoms and try what's the root cause. How do you have hundreds of thousands of women who can't be productive, whose lives are nothing more than just having babies and not really having any way of even interacting with these children once they go off into the world and are educated? So it was ideal. This job was ideal, and I think that's one of the reasons why I haven't found another job other than sitting on the board of the Open Society Initiative West Africa, because I'm looking for something that I'll be a natural in, that would bring out my sense of wanting things to be fair and have the platform and legitimacy to talk about it.